and Don came down to video our talk this morning. However, this is not the best day for this, with my voice being so indistinct, but I'll do the best I can.
You're doing
And I'll
perfect.
keep sucking on lozenges as I go. This history is, I would have canceled out, except this history is too important, and I'd probably crawl here if I had to. But we have over 100 years of American history that has been denied. You would think American history, with Americans, there would be no effort to sideline it, sabotage it, deny it. But that's exactly what's happened in Palm Beach County and in Layton County to a point. And we had to buck up against the powers that be to make this happen. Fortunately, we had a good ally in the Black Seminoles. Two are coming in right now. And they were supportive for the last 20 years. That's when we really started. Back in the 90s, I was one of the participants who discovered the battlefields in this park. And we're from the very first day of announcing that the two battles of the Loxahatchee were not up in Martin County someplace. They didn't even know where in Martin County. They just assumed it was Martin County. Good morning. Thank you for coming. They just assumed it was up in Martin County, but it was in Palm Beach County, and you would think that Palm Beach County would have been very eager to have this piece of history play its role here. But that was not the case. But I'm not going to get into the politics, because those people that were opposed to making this a historic place are now, through attrition, we just wore them out. They all retired. So now we have new blood with the county, and they get it. They have just put in this beautiful, took 10 years for that chickie. They just put in that beautiful chickie and the information board right beside it. And we also, they put in these roads for us, battlefield trails. And most important, and in my new issue of my book, I mention it, I call it the last battle of the Loxahatchee, which was name change. The reason I've been in this park for 20 years talking about these battles is because there was an apathy. You couldn't get it out. The newspapers would print one story and nobody would follow up or pick up on it. And so it would just fade away. So the only way to keep it alive, I thought, I still am on the Palm Beach County Historic Review Board, and I got on that board for the specific purpose of making sure that these battlefields and the men who fought and died here in 1838, and that was the Red Seminole, the Black Seminole, and the Army, the Navy, and the Marines all fought here. Famous personages from the Civil War fought here. In fact, Florida was a training ground for all the officers later who became generals during the Civil War. Of course, we had a president, two presidents. First one, Andrew Jackson, fought in the First Seminole War, when this was still, Florida was still a Spanish territory. The Second Seminole War, this is the one we're going to be talking about today, Zachary Taylor fought in the Battle of Okeechobee, which is only 3 weeks earlier than these two battles. In fact, we are a spillover. The Indians who fought here had fought in the Battle of Okeechobee. I'll tell you about that later. And then finally, two battles of the Loxahatchee took place, but it was a spillover from Zachary Taylor's battle, at the Battle of Okeechobee. And in fact, we found a letter, and that's in the book too, and I put it in this publication just came out a month or so ago. With some good luck, like yourselves, we had a gentleman come into the park to listen to the talk. And I believe in destiny. I think things are no accidents. I think things happen because there's a reason. And he came in here to talk, and he left. That's all. I never met him. Don't know who he was. And then about a year later, I get a phone call from Joe Rubenfein, and he says, I have a letter here I think you'd be interested in. He says, you know, you were talking about the General Jessup, not just a general, but he was the commander for the whole Florida theater. And he ran into the Seminoles, the Tennessee Volunteers, and he asked them to go to the river. And you couldn't explain why a general of his importance would rush up from the rear and make some sort of demands from somebody, no names are mentioned, and then runs to the river himself where he's shot in the face. He says, you're going to be interested in this. I got a letter, and this is a piece of history that no one has. I'm so happy about this. No one has this piece anywhere in the world. So the letter says, General Jessup was so upset with the Tennesseans that he came up and he did talk to the high command. In my first issue of my book, on page 82, I said, I don't understand why a general would be talking to the regular soldier and not the commander. You don't talk to the soldiers. I mean, you know, I don't want to call them peons, but you know where their rank is. You don't talk to them. A general even to a sergeant, this is a general should be talking to the commander. And there's nothing in any literature anywhere that says he did speak to a commander, except in this letter. In this letter, he says, oh yeah, Jessup came and he spoke to the commander of the Tennessee Volunteers, and he demanded that they go to the river, take his troops to the river. And he was denied. And he was so enraged, so angry, that the dear general, he had about 20, 30 years in the military. He lost it. That's why they don't report it. They don't report the good stuff. He lost it. He said, come on, man, follow me. And he got off his horse and he ran to the river. And when he got there, he turned around. There was nobody behind him. Not one single soldier followed him. Lucky that he turned around, because a musket ball, when he was turning, glanced right under his eye, broke his glasses, cut his face. If he hadn't turned around, that bullet would have gone right through his head. So he picked up his glasses and went back to the rear. And that just remained unanswered. And I finish it at the letter doesn't give us a clue who the commander was. There was really only one commander, Major William Lauderdale. The city of Lauderdale, for the youths who don't know, the soldiers named after Lauderdale. So if he was the commander, why wasn't there some reprimand? The only thing the general said to Washington was there was confusion amongst the Tennesseans. That's all he said. Anyway, the rest of it you'll find in the book. And however, it's not solved. It's left wide open, and I explain why. This morning we're talking about the clash of civilizations. What we're going to do is go over 350 years of history in one stroke. Because you hardly can't talk about two battles in a disconnect. Everything in life is connected. There are no disconnects. The one thing you learn about your history buffs, or you wouldn't be here, I hate that word buffs. You're enthusiasts, you're history enthusiasts. You're smart enough to know that history is important. Well, what's in history? Everything. There's culture in history. There's philosophy in history. There's politics in history. There's religion in history. Anyway, so 1492, as we learned in third grade, Columbus crossed the ocean blue, and his first stop was an island in the Bahamas that the natives, the Lucayans, called Guahami. They met him innocent, naked, with open arms, and they were repaid with smallpox, and within 15 years, 80,000 islanders disappeared. The Spaniards brought European diseases, not just smallpox. You have to remember the natives, Native Americans had no immunity, zero immunity. So simple things that we all had as kids, mumps, chicken pox, measles, whooping cough, would decimate the Native Americans. So within a short period of time, the Bahamas were now empty. Clash of civilizations. 1519. Suddenly there's an armada crossing the ocean to Mexico. 11 ships are now seen coming into Veracruz. The lookout runs back to capital city in Mexico, and it gets the word to Montezuma II that something strange is happening in the ocean. All these, they didn't call them boats, they didn't know what they were. And Montezuma looked very worried, they noticed, and he went back to the literature, if you will, their Bible, their legacy, their history, their predictions, their prophecy. And this is one that I really think is really kind of amazing. They had prophesied that the Toltec god would return. Quetzalcoatl would return. And he would be light-skinned with a beard, and he would appear from the east, from the ocean. Well, in the book, in the prophecy, they talk about this God coming in, and actually, if it's a God, what do? You pay full respect. Not only did they prophesy that these white men or light-skinned people would be coming, but they said when. They gave a date. Read 1. Excuse me. Reed 1, R-E-E-D 1. These gods would appear from the east. And guess what the date was? Read 1. Whoa. I say whoa because in the Mayan calendar, now we have several mixes of people. You had the Olmec, the Mayan, the Aztec, the Toltecs, the Mixtec. There were quite a few of them. But the Mayan were especially brilliant astronomers. And of course, we're all laughing about 2012, December. You've all heard that, the end of the world. If somebody hasn't heard that yet, you're not tuning in to TV, newspapers, and everything else. Yeah, they predicted the world would end 2012 in December, which is a ha-ha. Except when I just reviewed this and saw Read 1, I thought, whoa, whoa. I don't like that. But you know, we're so saturated with superstition. We are, not just those people. We all are saturated with superstition. It makes up part of our belief system, some of our philosophy, and some of our religion. A lot of mixture there. We have to sift out, as they said in the Bible. And if you don't sift out, you can become very fundamental in that you believe that everything written is absolutely what it is. I'm sliding into religion. I have to get away from it. Well, this is, they know this must be true because Cortez comes in with the men who are clad in iron. Their weapons are all iron, and they have these strange-looking deer without horns, horses. And these horses were on leashes, wild horses on leashes, and they certainly had to be gods because they had these things they had never seen before. They also had cannon and guns and all the rest of the bad things. And so they knelt down. They knelt down in front of Montezuma. He's being carried on the, it's interesting, the same way they carried the Hindu gods and the Egyptians and all the Mid-Eastern people would be carried on the shoulders of their people. He came in that way, and the priest who came before him, and they all knelt down in front of the Spaniards. They had no weapons. They knelt down in front of their gods. And at the signal, Cortez, who was famous for his brutality, his cruelty, and the fact that he killed 6,000 women and children during his visit, they were in a kneeling position. He gave the word, and they were all slaughtered. That was the beginning. Now, there's no way in hell that 300 or 400 Spaniards, I don't care how many cannon and guns they had, they soon would run out of ammunition, of course. But unfortunately, the Native American had one weakness, which carried through into our history, and that is they were always siding up with actually the enemy. And thousands of natives, Mexican natives, found this as an opportunity to overthrow Montezuma. So they sided with the Spaniards, and they actually attacked their own people. Well, we had that here in this country with our Native Americans. The Creeks, Red Sticks, they all worked with the British. They worked with us, Americans. They worked with the Spaniards. It's nothing new. That was one big weakness. It was Tecumseh who said that if the Native Americans would stick together against the white man, they could run him out of America. But being splintered off in all directions and joining him because they gave them money, they could be bribed. That was the thing. I had a storybook, ivory tower, little boy impression of these people, of the Native Americans, that they would not take a bribe. They were too honest. They're people of the soil. They would never take a bribe. They took bribes. That was part of the problem. The fact that they joined the white people to fought against their own people, and they did take bribes. And that's replete all through history. They did. See, we don't talk about the nasty stuff in history, and I don't feel that way. I feel history is history. And if I say Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, where's my book? I branch off a few times. You'll have to forgive me. That's my weakness, but I can't help it. I say it as I feel it. We hold that these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was mentioned at least 6 times during the Republican debate, those words. And we said, oh my God, the Declaration of Independence, that's the most wonderful thing in the world. And it was in 1776 when he wrote it, along with Thomas Paine helped him write that, and was edited by Ben Franklin, and John Adams. So sure, it's dynamite. One little problem. We talk about the whole reason we hear about these battles was about Indian removal. And we love to put all the blame on Andrew Jackson, who was a villain with Indian removal, no doubt about it, but he was a tool of 4 presidents. Indian removal, he issued the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Jackson did. But as early as 1809, Thomas Jefferson started the Indian removal in the United States. In fact, in 1809, he removed 1,000 Cherokees west of the Mississippi. Oh, you didn't get that in school. 1,000 Indians were removed by one of the presidents we hold the greatest esteem to. Now, I had one teacher that was here about a year ago, got up and said, I'm sorry, I can't stand to hear you talk that way about Jefferson. I said, I'm not talking that way about Jefferson, I'm giving you the history. And the history is not only Jefferson, but Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. In fact, in 1820, that's 10 years before Andrew Jackson becomes president, Monroe and John Quincy Adams drew up the papers, the documents, for Indian removal in writing. So, who is responsible for Indian removal? And all the great historians will tell you it was the American people. Those presidents did that because that was the mood of the people, especially in southeast United States, because that's where it all started. When Indian removal started, not with the Seminoles. No. It started long before the Seminoles. It started with the 5 civilized tribes. It started with the Creeks, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and then finally the Seminoles. So the history gets more interesting when you get into history, doesn't it? It's not dry as dust, as you heard people describe it. History is dynamite. Getting back to our subject. So we just left Cortez and his brutality. Well, a few years later, 1532, we have Pizarro come in. He came in and he invaded the Andes. Now, the Inca people had been a warlike people. They were great fighters. They had conquered 100 nations. There were also millions of those. And with 200 men, of course, smallpox had preceded him and weakened the nation considerably. With 200 men, he came in and he removed 200 tons of gold and silver. Gold was the sweat of the sun, and the moon were pearls, and silver was the pearls of the moon. That's how they described it. But because the same issue, because the natives worked with him, in fact, he married one of their princesses, worked with him, why the whole nation went down. Clash of civilizations. The clash continues here in America. Juan Ponce de Leon came in with Columbus in 1493, and he saw great opportunity, and he was hearing about all of the gold stories. So he went back and he had the king support him in sending an entourage to the New World. And as you remember in school, crossed the Bahamas, went up the Straits, not quite as far as, now the historians are saying, not quite as far as St. Augustine as we were taught in grammar school, but probably no further than Cape Canaveral. And there it was Easter, so he called it La Florida, where flowers were blooming. It was April, flowers were blooming. And then he made a U-turn and he came back down this way. And then they stopped. They talk about him going around to the West Coast. Before he went to the West Coast, that's why I think archaeology and history is so interesting to me. Because the archaeologists, and I'm friends with quite a few of them, they told me before they even wrote the paper on it, they had been in Seville, Spain, and they found, I'm sorry that I'm clicking with this, but if I don't keep my throat lubricated, you won't hear a word. They were in Seville, and they found that the Crown historian Antonio de Herrera had written in what year was it? 1569. Had a lot of dates to remember. 1569. He got a hold of Juan Ponce's logbook, and when he came south, he pulled into an inlet, and they feel pretty sure that the inlet he pulled into was the Jupiter Inlet. Now, that would mean that our American history began in little old Jupiter. He pulled into the Jupiter Inlet, he put down his longboat, and they oared ashore, and immediately the Hobe, or Yega, the two native tribes here, Yega was the main tribe and the Hobe were a sub-tribe, began to fire arrows at him and try to take his longboat. So he had to fight them off. He found them extremely hostile, almost like someone had been here before that was a Spaniard. They hated the Spaniards. And that you get, the testimony to that is if you read Jonathan Dickinson's journal, and you all should read it. It really explains who these Native Americans were, and they hated the Spaniards immediately. Well, there had to be a reason. Somebody got here before Juan Ponce de Leon, and actually they found out later that there were many slave-catching trips. And who were they catching? They were catching Indians as slaves. Those were your original slaves. Were the Native Americans were your original slaves. So they'd come in real quick and grab a few dozen, I guess, and take them back to Europe. But with Juan, we have everything documented. That's why it's neat. So he was so upset with the Hobe Indians and the hard time. He wanted to get water and food, and they just harassed him. So he got back in the boat, and they went south. They came in again around Riviera Beach. And there they met Indians who were very, very nice, gave them water, food, friendly. He thought enough of that to put that in the ship's log. Now that's unusual, that you'd put that in the ship's log, but thank goodness he did that. And when the developer who was developing Abacoa wanted a name, he was naming it Newtown, which was very common in American history to name a new place Newtown. But the people there thought it was too interesting, and they called up here and asked us if anybody could contribute a name, and one of the historians here gave them Abacoa, because the Abacoa Indians were so kind to Juan Ponce that they gave him the name Abacoa, and of course now we have Abacoa. So we have a lot of little ties, and I think that the fact that now they feel absolutely he came in here first. I'm waiting for the first history book. I didn't write it in my book. Should say it started here in Jupiter. All right, so what happened with that? When he landed here, 2 black slaves escaped from the ship. So the first landing of Africans actually we could say started in Jupiter. The next clash of civilizations began when the diseases from the Spaniards became not an epidemic, became a pandemic, wiping out thousands and then millions of people. An example of that was Mexico City had 20 million people, and when you learned in school about a very scant population in America, that was scapegoating. In one area alone, Mexico City had 20 million. And because of smallpox and all the other diseases, within 80 years, their population there was reduced to 1.5 million. And so David Standard, who wrote The American Holocaust, states that 95% 5% of the Native Americans over 400 years were decimated. From 1492 all the way to 1870, well, I'm trying to think of the date for the Sioux massacre at the Wounded Knee. Anyway, around 1870 or 1880, 1889, that's close enough. The point is, the date is not important. What's important is what happened at that time. And we, of course, we had the Wounded Knee. So for the beginning of the 1400s to the 1800s, we have 400 years of what David Standard calls the American Holocaust, a firestorm of violence against the Native Americans. That's very, very, very heavy, and it's true. You know, the weakness of history is the victors, not only do they get to plunder, but they get to write the history. And they minimize a lot of things. And as you will see as I go on, they're going to minimize the role of the black Seminoles. They almost are not in it. And yet, they're almost the whole thing. And I'll explain later what I mean by all that. So now we have the clash of civilizations in the new land here. And of course, in 1521, Juan Ponce, while I'm talking about him, comes back, and he brings something very important to the New World. Beside orange trees, he brought cows, horses, pigs, chickens, all the domesticated animals were brought in by Juan. And how is that important? Well, I love to tell the children, the first cowboys were not out west. The first cowboys were here in Florida because cows and horses came here first in 1521. And by the time the Spaniards were ready to leave Florida in 1763 with a deal with England, England took it for 20 years from 1763 to 1783. It became an English province. But when the Spaniards left, they had all these horses and cows and animals, and they couldn't take them all on their little boats. So they flung open the gates to the corrals, and all the animals went out. And when the nearby Indians, Georgia and South Carolina, began drifting south because of pressure from the white settlers, England was having a war with the Yamasee Indians in South Carolina. The frontiersmen were fighting back when the Indians would raid their settlements. So there was tremendous unrest. So they had to get away from it. The Confederation, the Creek Confederation, split up, and the upper creek separated from the lower creeks. And so where would they be going? Well, now the Spaniards are having a real problem. The Spaniards now have been using Native Americans for slaves. And the slaves are all dying off. And they have all these plantations around St. Augustine and in the middle around Tallahassee, Alachua. And what are they going to do for labor? Okay. We're going to have to go to Africa. Clash of civilizations. And so they went to Africa, and they captured men, women, and children. They took the strongest that they could find of the men and the women, split up families, herded them on the boats, brought them to the New World in horrible conditions. If they got sick, threw them overboard on the way. It was a disgusting display of inhumanity. Man's inhumanity to man. This is what history is supposed to be teaching us. Learn history, and you learn where you make your mistakes. Okay, so there's another really big clash. They estimate from 10 to 15 million of the Africans were brought to the New World. And where did they go? A lot of them went up. The British had them now. And so you had plantations in Georgia, South Carolina, in the Carolinas, Alabama. The Spaniards weren't stupid. They were pretty good. They said, I'll tell you what, come on down to Florida. If you come down to Florida, if you're an Indian, you'll be given your freedom. You can do whatever you like. And if you're a black slave in the plantations, of course, England happens to be their enemy. That would be nice. Come on down. Come on down to Freedom Land. Come on down to a safe haven. And if you do so, you get citizenship. You will be treated equally. And also, if you convert to Catholicism, and join our black militia, why you will be given your freedom. Well, not only were they given their freedom, but what I thought this is interesting, they also, at Fort Mose, when the blacks were coming in, the escaped blacks, when they were coming in, they had heard the place to go was St. Augustine, because the Spaniards had already set up a separate community. The first legally sanctioned black community in what is now the United States was Fort Mose, 1738. 1738 was long before the Revolution, long before there was a Seminole nation. So they were coming in 1738, and not only were they given their freedom, they could move around, they could join the black militia, and in the black militia they were paid the same salary as a Spanish soldier. They were allowed to pick their own leaders as captains and in various ranks. They were paid the same amount of money as the regular soldiers, Spanish soldiers, and they were allowed to carry firearms and travel wherever they wished to go. That's pretty democratic. And obviously, we've been taught over the years that the Seminoles did that. Yeah, the Seminoles did that. But now we get a glimpse that the Seminoles got this idea from the Spaniards. Because there was no Seminole nation in 1738. There were no Seminoles in 1738. Okay, where did the Seminoles come from? Well, I described all these various tribes, the Oconee, the Yamassees, the Yuchi, the Creeks, maybe some Cherokees, started drifting south because there was a rumor, beside Freedom Land, there was a rumor there's some kind of animals down there roaming around. One of them gives something they call milk. They're great when they're slaughtered. You become wealthy if you own a herd. The wealthiest Indians in the beginning were the cowkeepers Indians. Sikofi and Cowkeeper were here before there were no Seminoles yet. They drifted into Alachua, and there they saw these animals, and they realized that if you owned a lot of cattle and and horses, you'd be a very wealthy person. So they accumulated. Billy Bowlegs had at least 1,000 cattle that he slaughtered, 100 cows. I think it's a week for meat for his people. And when the Seminole Nation began to develop in 1775, they were able to trade with Cuba cows and black slaves and horses for ammunition and guns. And so the Seminoles grew up with guns. They were fine shots. They made a mockery of the U.S. military in their prowess and how to fire a gun. They grew up with guns. And a lot of the soldiers coming into Florida in the 1880s never saw a gun in their life. It came from Poland, from Italy, from Germany, from Ireland, from Britain, and they weren't prone to have guns. Some had guns, but most of them didn't have guns night and day. A Seminole child grew up with a gun. They knew what guns were. They still had bows and arrows, but they were crack shots. I'm just explaining that. Okay, so now we have a clash of civilizations in that the United States of America has got a taste of expansionism. You didn't get this in school. I'm going to connect some dots for you. Tom Jefferson came in 1801, and in 1803, France and England were doing their stuff together. They were fighting. Of course, 1812, we declared war on Britain. So by 1803, Tom Jefferson was able to send his negotiators to France to purchase the Louisiana Purchase. We paid $15 million for an area twice the size of the United States in those days. What a deal! Oh, wow! Maybe we should look into this. So now you see how it's going to develop. So he's got all this on a purchase of the Louisiana Purchase. So now Tom is looking around. What else can we do? Well, maybe we could buy Florida. That would be interesting. That would be that if we own Florida and get it away from Spain, that would protect our shores. Right now we're vulnerable through Florida. There's empty beaches. We could be invaded any time by the British, and we were in 1812. No, after we started war, they invaded us. So he negotiated, and I guess he must have talked to this upstart called General Andrew Jackson. And obviously, Andy was part of the scheme. And they sent him into Florida, one, to chastise the Seminoles who've been attacking some of the troops. Of course, we were in their area. We shouldn't have been there, but that's okay. And not only to chastise the Seminoles, but to intimidate the Spaniards. Have to teach these people a lesson. Well, not so much that. You know what? If we intimidate them, maybe we can get a good price on Florida. Well, it worked. Andrew Jackson came in. He raided in 1817. He raided several of the forts. And he also destroyed Seminole villages. And just for good luck, he executed 2 British subjects. One he hung, and the other one he put before a firing squad and shot them to death on very little evidence. And of course, that almost brought us to war again with Britain. You're shooting our people. What did they do to us so terrible? Well, they were sympathetic to the Seminoles. That's enough. So the clash of civilizations continues. And now we're coming up to the Second Seminole War. The Second Seminole War was 1835 to 1842. And now we have some people becoming famous. Osceola, Wildcat. I know you never heard of Wildcat. His real name was Cocochee. Indians call him Kawakache. And the soldiers called him Wildcat. It was easier to remember and to say. So I'll use Wildcat also. Yeah, if I go too long for your film,
keep going.
You can catch the next section the next time I do this. I have to do it in volume 1, volume 2, volume 3.
No problem at all.
Okay.
Just keep going.
So, no, I love this history so much. I love repeating it.
Oh, it doesn't show at all.
You know,
It doesn't show at
that's
all.
the whole story. I'm doing it for me. Even with a bad throat. So now we have Osceola rising on the scene. Osceola is a Creek. His mother was Polycopinger. That doesn't sound very Native American. And Her grandfather was James McQueen. That doesn't sound Native American. No, they were Scots. So his uncle, Peter McQueen, became a hostile agent against the U.S. Army when the U.S. Army came in to Florida. He was a prophet. Peter McQueen was a prophet, and he taught Osceola the importance of the Seminole tradition. Their tradition was very important, and he could see that the white element was weakening and dampening or diluting their traditions. And so he taught Osceola to try to get along with the whites, but the tradition was important not to lose. And Osceola was a natural leader, not a hereditary leader. He wasn't kin to Micanopy, who was the chief at that time. He was just an ordinary Native American who had tremendous charisma, talent, and intelligence. And he was destined to lead and became famous. Everyone heard of him. No one heard of Sam Jones. You should have heard of Sam Jones. Wildcat, he's very important, just as important as Osceola, because Osceola died very young. He died of a white man's disease. He died of malaria. What do you think of that? Actually, malaria came out of Africa, so he died of an African disease. And he was only active from 1834 to 1838, 4 years. And Wildcat, for instance, was the man for about 20-some years before he died of smallpox. Well, now we have a situation of where the Army has invaded Florida. The southern states had petitioned Washington that they were losing so many of their slaves to Florida, freedom land, that something had to be done. So Giddings writes in his book, and his book is still available, writes in his book that there was an excuse to bring the Army into Florida because not only did they want to move the Seminoles west of the Mississippi, that was so-called reasoning to invade Florida, to move the Seminoles west of the Mississippi to Indian territory, and also to bring back the escaped slaves from the plantations back into slavery, into the slave states. That was part of, well, we didn't learn that in school, but that was part of the message. In fact, they didn't teach you this either. The first main battle regarding slavery was not the Civil War, but it was the Second Seminole War. 25 years before the Civil War, they were fighting in Florida. The blacks were fighting for their freedom in Florida. It was the southern plantations were worried that this feeling of getting their freedom would sweep out of Florida into Georgia and the Carolinas. So they wanted to nip it in the bud, therefore they sent the Army in. So we have Second Seminole War was the longest, bloodiest, most costly Indian war in the nation's history, costing more than $30 million at a time when a dollar meant a lot, more than the American Revolution. And they promptly swept this history under the rug. Dr. Mann, who taught Florida history at the University of Florida for some 25 years, we got together when I was writing my book, before he died, anyway, a few years before he died. And he says in his introduction to his book that there was some kind of a conspiracy against telling the story of the civilized tribes in southeast Florida, and that the civilized tribes, one by one, were picked off and sent west of the Mississippi, and then finally the Seminoles. That all the attention given by movies, TV, and novels were all the Indians of the West. Well, I like to tell the kids that for 40 years, from 1817 to 1858, before Geronimo, before Sitting Bull, before Crazy Horse, we had the Seminoles in Florida with Osceola, Wildcat, and Sam Jones fighting the Army, Navy, and Marines to a standstill. And they still could it themselves as the only nation. They did not capitulate. They did not sign a treaty with us. They signed a truce only. So they're very proud of that. Okay, now we have, let's go back in time. Let's go back to all these various tribes coming into Florida in the early 1700s, and with them the black escaped slaves. So now it will make more sense to you. So you have the Oconees, your Masseys, and the Creeks, and all these people coming in. They're not Seminoles yet. They're coming into the Alachua area, North Florida, where they're finding horses, cows, all these wonderful animals, okay? And now we're into the Second Seminole War in 1835. Now the Army's got a little problem. They don't speak Indian. And of course the Indians don't speak English. Well, what are they going to do? Who speaks English around here? Oh, wait a minute. These people that escaped from the plantations, they speak English. Oh, guess what? While they were in Fort Mose, they learned Spanish. Now they speak English and Spanish. And now they're speaking Hittite and Muskogee, the dialects of the Indian. Well, who are these people? The black slaves were the only ones who could speak the languages, and so they were at every parley. And the most famous one of all was Abraham, a name you don't hear anywhere else, but you should know it. He was the prime minister for the Seminoles. Micanopy, unfortunately, was a little slow. The history books describe him as a bit stupid, and the reason Abraham rose to such prominence was because they had to use him in all their parleys. When they went to Washington, D.C. to deal with the government, Abraham was your head man. Micanopy just sat there, the figurehead. He couldn't understand English, and if he did, it wouldn't make any difference because Abraham was making all the decisions. They called him, during the First Seminole War, he fought Jackson. They called him Swamp Warrior. He fought against Jackson, and he was so successful as an interpreter that when Billy Bulllegs died, his young wife was given to Abraham as his wife. And he had 5 children, 4 boys and a girl, I think, or 4 girls and a boy, but it doesn't make any difference. But anyway, it shows you how close it became. And Wildcat in particular had a chief working with him, a black chief, John Horse Cavallo. John Horse is now becoming recognized. But when the Wildcat died of smallpox in Mexico, oh, I didn't tell you how he got to Mexico. Okay, at the end of the Second Seminole War, they were sent, the Seminoles were sent to New Orleans and then sent into Arkansas and Oklahoma. And unfortunately, they were placed with their enemies, the Cherokees, and so Wildcat and his people didn't like that, and they began secretly negotiating with Mexico to escape to Mexico. And when they escaped to Mexico, they did go through Texas, over the Rio Grande, into Mexico, and there they were given land for a reason. Mexicans heard the Seminoles were some great fighters. They were such great fighters, they said, well, do you think you could handle the problem we're having with the Comanches And the Apaches, they're the most fierce tribes, and we are just going bonkers trying to control them. And Wildcat said, no problem. We can handle the U.S. Army. We can handle them. And the reason he said we can handle the U.S. Army is the first three battles they had with the U.S. Army, the Seminoles won completely. The first one was, they called the Dade Massacre, December 28th. You know, you're going to have to, it's an hour, you're going to have to tell me when my time is up.
Just
5
keep,
minutes,
you
10
just
minutes?
keep going, the camera will stop
It's
when it
okay?
wants to stop.
Okay, I'll go until your tushies get numb. One of these hard
Well,
benches.
yeah, we've already passed that point.
So, anyway, Wildcat and his men came in, and they completely wiped out the Comanches and the Apaches. They're great fighters. And for that, they were given land, and they stayed in Mexico till the end of the Civil War. And then by that time, Wildcat had died, and John Horace Cavallo was complete command, had been for years and years, then slowly drifted back into the United States after the Civil War. Okay, what makes this very interesting is, going back again, is when the blacks became the interpreters, the teachers, the strategists for the Seminoles, the U.S. Army had to deal with them and got to know who they were and got to know their importance. And that's why the general himself said, this is not an Indian war, this is a Negro war. And because the Negroes, or the blacks at that time, helped perpetuate it. They wanted to keep it going because if the war was over, they'd have to go back to their plantations as slaves, and they weren't anxious to do that. So I say in the beginning of my book, it's dedicated to the Red Seminoles who fought for their land, dedicated to the Black Seminoles who fought for their freedom from slavery, and also it's dedicated to the white soldiers, the Army, Navy, and Marines who had a duty to perform, and they performed their duty. And we do that in all these wars. We're in a lot of nonsense wars. If you really read history, anyway, yeah, that's what happens in real life. It's not a comic book, real life. Okay, what I'll do then is I'll outline real quick the battles. Dade's battle, December 28th, 1838. Two troops of soldiers were heading north from Fort Brooke to Fort King, which is Ocala, and the Seminoles ambushed them, stood up, and fired the first shot into the advance guard and killed Major Dade and all his officers. The first volley killed half of the two companies. Half the men were decimated with the first volley because Seminoles were crack shots. When they examined Major Dade, Micanopy was the one who shot him, and they examined him. The bullet went right through his heart. Dead shot. Perfect shot. And that's the reason on the first volley, half the men are gone, and they struggled from 9 o'clock in the morning, slowly being shot down. They built the breastwork, but they didn't have time. They had a cannon. They fired a cannon. The cannon frightened the Seminoles who went off. And while they went off, the soldiers quickly built a triangular breastwork, but only with 3 tiers, not high enough. And when the Indians came back, they finished off the rest except for 3 and then 2. 2 got back to Fort Brooke to tell us the story. Ransom Clark and Sprague got back. 3 days later, we have another battle. This was with Osceola, and he defeats Major General Clinch and and Call. They were the two generals. And then we have February 28th, 1836. That was the big one. That's when the whole Seminole Nation stood up against General Gaines and his 1,100 soldiers, pinned him down. They had to build a breastwork also, pinned him down for 10 days. They had to eat slaughter their horses and their mules for food. They called to General Scott, Winfield Scott, and Scott, because he disliked what Gaines had done, he came in too soon. He refused to send troops immediately, but Clinch knew that was just a feud, and he went in anyway, and finally rescued them. But the Indians, 1,500 Indians, stood up against 1,100 and had to pin them. And if they'd stayed long enough, they probably would have done great damage to the army. Well, guess who's the president? The president is Andrew Jackson, and he's saying, "Oh my God, what is this? You mean to tell me he liked to use the word racist and savage?" I'm sorry. He was a racist. Andrew Jackson didn't hide it. He was a racist. And he said, "I can't believe this. They're a bunch of savages, have won 3 major battles. We have to do something about this." So he fires all the generals all the way down to the quartermaster general, and that's Jessup. Jessup had been a quartermaster general for 18 years, and now it was his turn in the box. And what he did very quickly is he put in, what did I do with my, I put up maps and then I don't use them. He instead of using 3 columns, the way Scott did, he uses 7 columns in a pincer movement. World War II pincer movement with 7 columns, then reduced to 4 columns. Okay, now we're coming to the battles here. What he did is he divided the troops up. And before I tell you about that, let me tell you how many troops were involved. United States of America in 1837 had 7,000 soldiers.